Do you see what I see? It's Storytime with Uncle Scotty. Hello, I am Uncle Scotty, your host for Storytime with Uncle Scotty. We have our own mugs because things are just fantastic here at Storytime with Uncle Scotty. We're staying hydrated. We're keeping clean. Everything is fine. Everything is great, actually. Mostly because we have time. So much time together. And that's the most important thing in my book, in my mind. Time is on my side. Both sides, sometimes. Check us out on Patreon if you would like. We have things on there like mugs and bookmarks and other stories, if you would like. As you can recall, this story that we are reading is called Sideways Stories from Wayside School, which was built sideways. Wayside School was built sideways. Not on the ground, but straight up and down. The book is written by Lewis, and we have been learning about all of these people in Wayside School on the 30th story. We've learned about 2 teachers. We've also talked about some other teachers, but we've learned about 2 teachers, 1 dead rat, and 13 children. Let's find out who our next person that we're going to learn about from Sideways Stories from Wayside School. Chapter 17. John. John had light brown hair and a round head. He was Joe's best friend. John was one of the smartest boys in Mrs. Jewell's class, but he had one problem. He could only read words written upside down. Nobody ever wrote anything upside down. But it was only a little problem. John was still in the high reading group. He just turned his book upside down. It was easier for John to turn his book upside down than to learn to read correctly. But the easiest way wasn't always the best way. Listen to this. This is important. It's a gem. The easiest way wasn't always the best way. Mrs. Jewell said, "John, you can't go on reading like this. You can't spend the rest of your life turning your books upside down." "Why not?" asked John. "Because I said so," said Mrs. Jewell. "Besides, what happens when I write something on the blackboard? You can't turn the blackboard upside down." "No, I guess you're right," said John. "I know I'm right," said Mrs. Jewell. "You're going to have to learn to stand on your head." It's a curveball from Mrs. Jewell. John couldn't stand on his head. He had given up trying. You would have too if you had fallen over as many times as he had. Oh, because remember, very first words of this chapter, John had light brown hair and a round head. Joe was John's best friend. He could stand on John's head. Every time John fell over, Joe stood on his head. After all, what are best friends for? "My head is too round, Mrs. Jewell. I can't stand on it," said John. "Of course you can, John," said Mrs. Jewell. "If Joe can stand on your head, so can you." "It's easy, John," said Joe. "I can't," John repeated. "It always falls over." "Nonsense," said Mrs. Jewell. "All you have to do is find your center of balance. Now, up you go." Here we have John, the big round head. Joe, with all the curly hairs on his head, 17,000 something curly head, standing on John's head. John seems much bigger than Joe. I guess they get along fine. John put his round head on the floor and swung his legs up. He fell right over. Then Joe stood on John's head. "See, John, it's easy. Nothing to it," Joe said. "We'll help you, John," said Mrs. Jewell. "Joe, get off John's head now and give me the pillow from under my desk. Nancy, Calvin, come here and give us a hand." Mrs. Jewell took the pillow from Joe and set it on the floor. "All right, John, we'll surround you. We won't let you fall." John put his head on the pillow and swung his legs up. He started to fall one way, but Nancy pushed him back up. Then he started to fall another way, but Calvin straightened him up. John kept falling a little bit this way and that way until he at last found his center of balance. Here you can see that. "Hey, look at me, said John. "I'm up, I'm really up, I'm standing on my head. I found my center of balance. It's beautiful. I can read the blackboard. Hey, Calvin, Bring me a book. You don't have to turn it upside down. Hey, bam! While Kama went to get the book, John fell flat on his face. You better stay off my head, Joe, he warned. Are you all right? Asked Miss Jules. Yes, I think so. I feel a little funny. Hey, I can still read the blackboard and I'm not upside down. I can read right side up now. When I fell, I must have flipped my brain or something. That is wonderful, John, said Mrs. Jules. Here, put the pillow back under my desk. As a reward, you may have a Tootsie Roll Pop. They are in the coffee can on top of my desk. John placed the pillow on top of her desk. Then he looked under the desk, but he couldn't find the Tootsie Roll Pops anywhere. Because he flipped his brain upside down, and he doesn't know up or down. Funny. I have a little story to tell before we tell this other story. When I was in 7th grade, we were reading in class, and everyone was going around the class reading, and I wanted to entertain myself because I had a big mouth. And so I had my book. Well, this book you can see. So see, this is right side up. And I held the book like this, upside down, and I was following along as everyone read it. And the teacher was like, Scotty, your turn to read now. And so what they thought was, because I was holding it upside down, that I would have trouble reading it. But I was like, Ramona relaxed. This did not sound so bad, even though she had never thought of reading as attacking words. She rather liked the idea. Mrs. Quimby read on. She is learning her numbers really, really readily. Right? And the teacher was like, no, that's not how it should sound if you're reading the book upside down, is it? So I was like, and then he wrote my name on the blackboard under discipline, and I got a note sent home. So, just a cautionary tale to not be a smart aleck in class. And just because I or you may not be the most entertained at the time doesn't mean that you should let your attention float off and do things that aren't respectful or mischievous. That has been a helpful tip from Uncle Scotty based on all of his years of being in school. Maybe we'll have more of those later. But before we have those, let's read one more story from Sideways Schools from Wayside Stories. Chapter 18, Leslie. We remember Leslie. She had the pigtails. And she got Paul in trouble. Hashtag Paulways. Chapter 18, Leslie. Leslie had 5 fingers on each hand and 5 toes on each foot. For each hand, she had an arm, and for each foot, she had a leg. She was a very lucky girl. She had 2 lovely, long, brown pigtails that reached all the way down to her waist. When Mrs. Jules asked a question, Leslie would raise one of her hands. When Leslie was adding, she could count on her fingers. When Paul pulled one of her pigtails, she could kick him with one foot while standing on the other. But Leslie had one problem. She didn't know what to do with her toes. She had 10 adorable little toes and nothing to do with them. As far as she could tell, they served no useful purpose. Suck your toes. That's what I do, said Sherry. But Leslie's foot wouldn't reach her mouth. Well, that's all toes are good for, said Sherry. She put one foot in her mouth and went to sleep. Remember, Sherry has the big coat, likes to sleep all the time. No, thought Leslie. They must be good for something. They just have to be. During recess, she asked Dana, Dana, what do you do with your toes? I scratch the back of my legs, said Dana. First, I scratch my left leg with my right foot. Then I scratch my right leg with my left foot. But my legs don't itch. My legs don't itch, said Leslie. Remember, Dana had all the mosquito bites and the glasses. That's good, said Dana. In that case, you can scratch my legs. With your help, I can scratch both legs at the same time. No, never mind, said Leslie. She walked up behind Louis, the yard teacher, and hopped on his shoulders. Louis, said Leslie, I don't know what to do with my toes. Louis tugged her foot. Yes, that is a serious problem, he said. But I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll take them off your hands for you, or rather, your feet. Just cut them off and give them to me. What? Said Leslie. You don't want them, so I'll take them, said Louis. You don't have to worry about them ever again. No, said Leslie. I'll give them to Miss Mush, said Louis. She can make little hot dogs out of them. Miss Mush was the lunch teacher. No, I'm not going to give my toes away, said Leslie. All right, said Louis. I'll give you a nickel apiece for them. No, you can't have them, said Leslie. Why not? Louis asked. They're no good to you anyhow, and think of all you could buy for 50 cents. Probably an album like Get Rich or Die Trying. The bell rang. I'll think it over, said Leslie. She ran back to class. Mrs. Jules, said Leslie, I don't see any good reason for keeping my toes. Oh, Leslie, I'm sure there are lots of good reasons, said Mrs. Jules. Well, I can't think of any. My legs don't itch, and I can't get my foot in my mouth. Louis offered me a nickel apiece for them, and it seems to me like a good deal. But I wanted to check with you first. I think Louis is pulling your leg, said Mrs. Jules. No, said Leslie. He was pulling my toes. Why would he want with your toes? What would he want with your toes? Asked Mrs. Jules. I don't know, said Leslie. But if he's willing to give me 5 cents apiece for them, then I'm going to take him up on it. That's 50 cents. In the club. No, she didn't say that. That's 50 cents. Not so fast, said Louis. Let me look at them first. Sorry, I skipped a line. That's 50 cents, she said to Miss Jules. At lunch, Leslie walked up to Louis. Okay, Louis, she said, you can have my toes for a nickel apiece. That will be 50 cents. Not so fast, Louis said. Let me look at them first. Leslie took off her shoes. Yes, said Louis. The big ones are good, and the ones next to them, but the most I'll give you for the rest of your toes is 3 cents each. Leslie was furious. 3 cents each? You told me 5 at recess. I'll give you 5 cents for the big ones, but look at that scrawny little runt of a toe on the end there. You're lucky to be even getting 3 cents for it. I think you're getting a darn good deal. I happen to like that toe, said Leslie. Fine then, said Louis. Keep it. I'll just take the 2 big toes and we'll call it square. He reached in his pocket and pulled out a dime. Nothing doing, said Leslie. These toes are sold as a set. It's either all 10 for 50 cents or no deal. What am I going to do with just 8 toes? Then forget it, said Louis. I'm not going to give you a nickel for those scrawny little end toes. Fine, said Leslie. No deal. My toes will still be here if and when you change your mind. She turned and walked towards the hopscotch area. Wait a second, Louis called. I'll give you $1 for each of your pigtails. Leslie turned around and looked at him with fiery eyes. Cut my hair, she exclaimed. Are you crazy? And here you can see Leslie saying, what? It's funny, she was willing to cut off all of her toes, but there's no way she would ever cut her hair. And we will find out what happens next on Next Time with Storytime with Uncle Scotty. I have been your host with our own mugs, Uncle Scotty. Hydration is good. See you next time. Bye.